Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
When I was 9, we had this new family move in across the street. They had a daughter my age, and she quickly became my best friend. She also had 2 pet bunnies. These bunnies were the softest, fluffiest things you could imagine. I'd never had a pet like that before. Sure, I had a dog, but it was nothing like the calm little creatures who could sit in your lap and snuggle. Her family's house became the go-to place for a bunch of us neighborhood kids. We'd play outside and the bunnies would hop around in the yard, keeping us company. For a couple of years, everything was peaceful. The neighborhood was the perfect image of suburbia. Well-manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, the kind of place where you thought things couldn't possibly go wrong. But then, of course, the HOA decided to make their presence known. The HOA itself wasn't awful at first, just the usual stuff. Don't paint your house a garish color. Keep the grass trimmed, basic rules like that. But that all changed when HOA a-hole came onto the scene. This guy lived on the other side of the new neighbors. His house was the one that looked like a botanical garden. You could practically hear the smugness from his yard. He was a high-ranking member of the board, and I could already tell he'd be trouble. Sure enough, HOA a-hole started showing up at board meetings with the most ridiculous complaints. "There's a weed on your lawn," or "Your fence is off by an inch." Everyone else just rolled their eyes. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that this guy had way too much time on his hands and way too many rules in his head. Then came the bunnies. For 2 years, these bunnies were harmless. The neighbors had them in a small pen outside, never left them out when they weren't around, and we were always careful with them. But the HOA a-hole found out that they weren't officially domesticated, and I guess that was enough for him to decide that their very existence in our pristine neighborhood was a violation of HOA code. He was hell-bent on making sure that these bunnies, who had done absolutely no harm, were kicked out of the neighborhood. He dug deep into the HOA bylaws, found the tiniest loophole, and raised a big fuss. He insisted that these were non-domesticated animals, and therefore had to go. So the HOA sent out a letter to the new neighbors. The letter said they had to remove the bunnies immediately, or else fines would start stacking up. Now, this was ridiculous. The bunnies were friendly little creatures. They weren't tearing up gardens or attacking anyone. But HOA a-hole didn't care. So what did the new neighbors do? They tried to reason with him. They went over to his house and knocked on the door. The conversation went like this. "Look, our daughter loves these bunnies," the dad said. "They're harmless. They're just pets. We've kept them indoors for the most part." But HOA a-hole just grinned, that awful smug grin of his. "Tell Bugs goodbye, kid," he said to their daughter. You could see her face drop. She didn't understand what was happening. She was just a 9-year-old girl. All she knew was that her beloved pet bunny was being taken away because some grown man wanted to flex his power. The new neighbors had already made plans to move back across the country. Their minds were set and they weren't going to stick around much longer. So technically, they could have just ignored the letter. They could have kept their heads down, let the HOA send a few more notices, and by the time the fines started to accumulate, they'd be long gone, already on their way to their new home. Nobody would have been the wiser. It would have been easy, almost too easy. But that wasn't what they had in mind. They weren't about to let the HOA's petty little rules ruin what little time they had left in the neighborhood. No, they wanted to leave with a bang, not a whimper. Instead, they decided to give HOA a-hole a little taste of his own medicine. The dad drove out to a friend's property in a rural part of town. He caught 4 wild bunnies, which wasn't hard, and then he let them loose in the neighborhood, and not just anywhere. He let them loose in HOA a-hole's yard, right in the middle of his fancy garden that he'd spent years perfecting. The bunnies did what bunnies do best. They hopped around, ate some flowers, and made a mess. At first, it wasn't too bad. A couple of bunnies were easy to chase off, but then more showed up. A few weeks later, there were more. Before long, the whole neighborhood was crawling with bunnies. They were everywhere. Under the bushes, hopping across lawns, making tunnels in the grass. It wasn't long before the population was out of control. For HOA a-hole, this was the beginning of a nightmare. His perfectly manicured yard, which he'd spent years obsessing over, was now a bunny playground. His flowers were nibbled down to nothing, and his carefully laid-out garden was a chaotic mess of fur and feet. And you could hear him complaining. He was all over the neighborhood, yelling about how the HOA needed to do something. "This isn't right," he'd shout. "These bunnies are ruining my property," but the rest of us, we just stood by and watched. We didn't really care. The bunnies weren't hurting anyone. They were just cute little creatures that had found a new home. And honestly, it was kind of hilarious to watch HOA a-hole try and fail to get rid of them. The HOA didn't even take him seriously. No one else cared enough to get involved. The board members were too busy dealing with their own little issues to worry about a few wild bunnies, and HOA a-hole was left trying to handle it on his own. He'd try to trap them, put up barriers, and even posted signs in his yard that said, "No bunnies allowed." It didn't work. The bunnies had already taken over. A few months later, it was clear. The neighborhood was officially overrun. The bunnies weren't just in HOA a-hole's yard anymore. They were everywhere. They were in front yards, backyards, hopping along sidewalks, and burrowing in people's gardens. For the most part, they stayed out of the way. But for HOA a-hole, it was a constant reminder that his little crusade had backfired spectacularly. He spent the next several months petitioning the HOA, trying to get them to do something. He begged them to bring in pest control. He even called animal control, but they couldn't do anything either. The bunnies had already made themselves at home, and no one cared enough to evict them. Years went by. The bunnies stayed, and HOA a-hole, he just gave up. His garden was still a mess, and the bunnies were still there, living in their little bunny kingdom in the middle of what had once been his perfect suburban paradise. 20 years later, and the neighborhood is still a bunny hideaway. HOA a-hole is still there, sitting in his yard, watching bunnies hop by. His garden, well, it's a bit of a joke now. The neighbors all laugh when they see him out there trying to keep the bunnies away. He never did get his yard back to the pristine condition it once had. And all of it happened because he couldn't leave a 9-year-old girl's pet bunnies alone. The bunnies live on, and honestly, that's the way it should be. We moved to the country. Nearest neighbor's gate was about 150 yards, 450 feet, 137.16 meters, from ours. We open-carried Colt .45 caliber semi-auto handguns at the advice of the local sheriff's deputy, as it could take him 23 minutes to make it to us from the other side of his patrol area. Anyway, we heard a child screaming loudly. Soon thereafter, joined by a second then third child, we took off running towards the screaming children, getting to neighbor's house with 4 to 5 peacocks in the front yard. Met the neighbors, all good, and they were happy that we showed up to help their children. I now want some peacocks. I live in a rural area. We have always had some snakes, but a couple of years ago when the locusts were out in force, the snakes were everywhere, including in the house. One actually chased me into the house. Right after that I read and by a snake expert saying snakes don't chase people. That is BS, because was just sitting on my back porch and looked up to see this snake just sitting there staring at me, then just started slithering at me quickly. I have never jumped up and ran so fast. My daughter also used to play this game where she put her stuffed snake on the ground and yell snake and run away from it, so when she came into the bathroom yelling snake, I thought she was playing her game. Come to find out, there was a real snake climbing up the frame of the front door. They really were everywhere though. I have never seen anything like it before or since. I still get jumpy because I keep thinking I see snakes out of the corner of my eye, and it has been 2 years since the summer of the snakes. I would feel so much better with some peacocks wandering around. Read up, peacocks are great for snake control. And snakes don't chase people? You're right. A buddy of mine and I were out on his dad's ranch target shooting. My buddy was kind of a cocky bastard and he was searching through some knee-length grass looking for his expended brass while I loaded up the truck. All of a sudden I hear, "Oh shit," and look. He jumps about 3 feet in the air and unloads his .45 Win mag at his feet, pauses and goes, "Oh shit," and takes off running. Out of the tall grass come 2 copperheads on his heels. He starts screaming, "Get the shotgun, get the shotgun." I just had to laugh and yelled back, "Run faster." But yes, snakes will chase you. Generally not rattlers, but copperheads and water moccasins will damn sure do it. Anybody that says different is as full of junk as a Christmas turkey.
If you like our stories, then please like and subscribe and comment, and remember to hit that bell icon so you never miss out. We have new stories almost every day.
I moved into a brand new home. One of those developments where everything looks shiny and perfect on the surface, but underneath it's all a mess waiting to explode. The community is split into 2 phases, with a nice wooded area in between. Phase 1 is where all the trouble seems to be, and now that Phase 2 is finished, it's like there's a huge wall between the two. Phase 1 residents have made it clear they're not thrilled about us being here, even though we're technically all supposed to be one community. It didn't take long before the HOA drama kicked in. I was a bit naive, thinking it would be smooth sailing, but oh how wrong I was. We're getting ready to run for the HOA board, trying to bring some sense of balance to the whole thing. People on Phase 1 have been way too cozy with the HOA board, and now we're seeing the results. The landscaping contract that's been in place for years is held by one of the loudest voices in Phase 1. He's one of those guys who wants it both ways. He's got his hand in the pot, but he also wants to pretend like he's the community hero. So it wasn't exactly a shock when he announced that there was going to be a parade. Great, right? A parade. Everyone loves a parade except for the fact that this one was being thrown by none other than. And there was no room for Phase 2. I'm sitting there asking if the parade would come through Phase 2, thinking maybe it could be a nice way for both phases to mingle. But no, we were shut down instantly. It's a safety concern, they said. You can come if you want. The tone was dismissive, as if it was just some afterthought. Then a few more of us tried suggesting ways to make it work. We offered ideas like having the police help with traffic or neighbors volunteering to direct traffic on the main road. But every suggestion was met with a hard no. It felt like they had already decided that Phase 2 wasn't welcome, and no amount of reasoning would change that. At one point, this girl from Phase 2 spoke up. She said, "Fine, when are the meetings for the parade? I'll help out." The next thing we knew, the entire parade route, along with every detail, was blasted through the management app. All of it in 20 minutes. I could practically feel the smugness radiating from Phase 1 as they set everything up for themselves. The parade route went through side of the neighborhood. Not a single inch of it touched Phase 2. It felt like a slap in the face, like we weren't even part of this community. I wasn't going to just sit there and let it happen. I figured, since Phase 2 was being completely ignored, I'd throw a separate event on our side of the neighborhood. At least that way, the residents of Phase 2 could have a chance to enjoy some kind of celebration, even if it wasn't parade. It was going to be a party, nothing big, just something to give us a chance to meet and mingle, away from all the drama. Plus, parking was going to be a nightmare over there on parade day. So this was my way of making sure our side of the neighborhood didn't get left out. I asked management if they'd be willing to post about my event. Maybe a little help in getting the word out. They immediately shot me down. "This is not an HOA-sponsored event," they said, "but everyone is welcome." They made sure to emphasize that could come to the parade if they really wanted to. But let's be real here. How many people from Phase 2 were actually going to show up when there was no parking, no real invitation, and no effort to include us? The whole situation started to escalate. A few people from Phase 2 were upset about my party idea, calling me out for trying to do something separate. They said I was undermining the idea of us being one community. "You're the one always talking about being a single neighborhood, but now you're throwing a separate event? Why even bother trying to bring us together?" they said, practically pointing fingers. It wasn't like I was trying to make things worse. I was just trying to do something for our side of the neighborhood. But no, I was the one being selfish. It's like everything I did was wrong. And it wasn't just from Phase 1, it was from some people in Phase 2 too. The weird thing was, nobody was willing to acknowledge the fact that Phase 2 had been completely ignored in the parade planning. No one cared that the parade wasn't even going to come near us. It was like we were invisible. And then, as if the whole thing wasn't frustrating enough, I started to get the feeling that Phase 1 was using this parade as a way to remind us of our place. They were going to have their parade, their way, and no one was going to stop them. And if that meant making Phase 2 feel like an afterthought, then so be it. I was worried, honestly, that they were going to get everything they wanted. What if they ended up making us feel like we had no say in anything? What if they pushed us out completely? People from Phase 1 had already made it clear that they didn't care about Phase 2's needs. So who was going to stand up for us? It seemed like if we didn't push back now, we'd end up getting steamrolled. The parade was just the beginning, though. As I watched Phase 1 organize everything without a care for Phase 2, I couldn't help but feel like this was only the start of the divide. People kept talking about unity and community, but all I saw was a one-sided affair where Phase 1 had all the power, and Phase 2 was left to pick up the scraps. It wasn't going to get better, not unless something drastic happened. But what could we do? How much longer could we just sit back and watch as they controlled everything? I wasn't the only one who felt this way either. Other people from Phase 2 were starting to get fed up too, but it wasn't like we could do anything about it. The HOA board was stacked with people who were too cozy with Phase 1. It felt like we didn't even have a chance to make a difference. In the end, it didn't matter. The parade came and went. Phase 1 celebrated, and Phase 2 was left to do its own thing. I did end up throwing that separate event, but it wasn't the same. The excitement of the parade had already passed, and no one seemed interested in anything else. The divide between Phase 1 and Phase 2 was more obvious than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start of a long, ugly battle for control. No one learned anything, not in Phase 1, not in Phase 2. The parade came and went, and all it did was make the gap between us wider. This sounds so petty, typical HOA. Just 'cause they had no say in Phase 2 doesn't mean they should look down on another part of their community and hold it against them. Do whatever you can to make their lives hell lol. Yeesh, they're 100% mad at the wrong people, and are either too stupid or too lazy to take it up with whomever actually made the call on adding another phase instead of their precious amenities. Sorry, your group has to deal with a bunch of snarky elitists with severe only child syndrome. If there's ever a satisfying retaliation or outcome to this, please keep us updated.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.